How a shared garden becomes a bridge between hearts. Chapter 1. Morning Reflections. Margaret Henley stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint golden streaks across her backyard. At 72, she had perfected the art of savoring quiet mornings. The house felt different now, larger somehow, without Tom's gentle snoring drifting from the bedroom or the rustle of his newspaper at the breakfast table. 2 years since his passing, and she still caught herself setting out 2 cups. The yard stretched before her, a testament to decades of shared labor. Tom's prized tomatoes grew wild now, their vines sprawling beyond the neat rows he'd once maintained. Margaret's flower beds, however, bloomed with renewed purpose. Roses climbed the trellis he'd built their first spring here in Millbrook, Ohio, 38 years ago. The garden had been their common ground, the place where his practical nature met her love of beauty. She sipped her coffee and smiled at the memory of their first argument over garden planning. Tom wanted straight rows of vegetables, sensible and efficient, he'd said in his no-nonsense way. Margaret dreamed of curved paths winding between flower beds. They'd compromised, creating a garden that was both functional and beautiful, just like their marriage had been. The phone rang, interrupting her reverie. She recognized her daughter Susan's number and felt the familiar tightness in her chest. "Hi, honey," Margaret said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Mom, I've been thinking." Susan's tone carried that determined edge Margaret knew well. "This house is too much for you. Mrs. Patterson from down the street said there's an opening at Sunset Manor. It's a lovely place and—" "Susan, we've discussed this." "I know, but Mom, you're all alone in that big house. What if something happens? What if you fall?" Margaret looked out at the garden, where a cardinal had landed on Tom's old bird bath. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Really, that's what you always say. But Jake and I worry. We're 3 hours away, and with his job." "I understand your concerns," Margaret said gently. "But this is my home." After hanging up, Margaret felt the familiar ache of distance between them. Susan meant well, but somewhere along the way, their easy closeness had shifted. Maybe it started when Susan married Jake, a good man, but one who spoke in spreadsheets and efficiency reports. Or perhaps it began earlier, when Susan chose college in California, then law school, then a life so different from the one she'd grown up with in Millbrook. Margaret refilled her coffee and stepped outside. The morning air carried the scent of Mrs. Kowalski's herb garden next door. Edith Kowalski had been her neighbor for 15 years, ever since moving from Poland to live with her son's family. They'd shared recipes, garden tips, and the comfortable silences of women who understood each other despite their different backgrounds. But 3 months ago, Edith's son Michael had decided his mother needed proper care and moved her to an assisted living facility in Columbus. The house next door sat empty now, its windows dark and garden untended. Margaret walked to the fence that separated their yards. Edith's once thriving vegetable garden had become a tangle of weeds. Her carefully tended herbs were struggling to survive. It broke Margaret's heart to see it. She thought about Susan's words. Maybe her daughter was right. Maybe she was holding on to something that no longer made sense. But as she looked at the garden she and Tom had built together, at the life they'd created in this place, she couldn't imagine starting over somewhere else. Chapter 2. Unexpected Visitors. The following Tuesday, Margaret was weeding her rose bed when she heard voices next door. She looked up to see Michael Kowalski walking around the yard with a young woman and 2 small children. The woman was heavily pregnant, one hand resting on her belly as she pointed toward different areas of the property. "Mrs. Henley," Michael called when he spotted her. "Good to see you." Margaret walked to the fence, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "Hello, Michael. How's your mother?" "She's doing well, thank you. Complaining about the food, so you know she's feeling like herself." He smiled, but Margaret caught the weariness around his eyes. "I'd like you to meet Maria, my daughter-in-law. She and David are thinking about buying the house." The young woman approached the fence, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face kind but tired. "Mrs. Henley? I'm Maria Santos. These are my children, Elena and Carlos." The little girl, perhaps 6 years old, peeked shyly from behind her mother's skirt. The boy, maybe 4, was already investigating a butterfly near the neglected tomato plants. "It's lovely to meet you," Margaret said. "Are you from Columbus?" "We've been renting there, but David got a job at the plant here in Millbrook." We thought it might be nice for the children to grow up in a smaller town. Maria's hand moved protectively over her belly. The baby's due in October. Carlos, leave those alone, Maria called as the boy reached toward the tangled vines. Oh, he's fine, Margaret said. Those are just volunteer tomatoes. Your grandmother-in-law had quite the green thumb, Michael. She talks about this garden all the time, Michael said. She misses it. Margaret felt an idea forming, tentative but growing stronger. Maria, have you done much gardening? Not really. I grew up in an apartment in the city, but I'd love to learn, especially for the children. Carlos, Elena, would you like to see something special? Margaret asked. The children nodded eagerly, and she opened the gate between the yards, something she and Edith had installed years ago for easy visiting. She led them to a corner of her garden where she'd created a small children's area during her teaching years, back when neighborhood kids would stop by after school. Low-growing flowers formed a natural circle around a flat stone that served as a tiny table. This is my fairy garden, she explained, watching Elena's eyes grow wide. See how the flowers make a little house? And if you're very quiet in the morning, sometimes you can spot the fairy footprints in the dirt. Carlos squatted down, studying the ground intently. I don't see any. You have to look very carefully, Margaret said with a wink at Maria. They're quite small. Mrs. Henley, Maria said softly, would you? I mean, if we do move here, would you mind if the children visited sometimes? I'd love for them to learn about gardens. Looking at this young mother, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. I think that would be wonderful. Chapter 3, Seeds of Memory. That evening, Margaret called Susan. Mom, you sound different tonight, Susan said after they'd exchanged pleasantries. I met some people today, a young family looking at the Kowalski house. Margaret found herself telling Susan about Maria and the children, about the neglected garden and the fairy ring that had captivated Elena. That's nice, Mom, but Susan, do you remember when you were little, how you used to help me and Dad in the garden? There was a pause. Vaguely, I remember dirt under my fingernails and you always telling me to be careful with the flowers. Margaret laughed softly. You were so eager to help, but you had a tendency to pull up the good plants along with the weeds. Your father made you your own little section to practice in. I remember that. Susan's voice brightened. Behind the garage, right? I grew radishes because they came up so fast. And carrots. You were so proud of those carrots, even though most of them were too small to eat. I haven't thought about that in years. Susan was quiet for a moment. Mom, why are you bringing this up? Margaret wasn't entirely sure herself. I guess meeting these children today reminded me of how important those times were. Not just the gardening, but the sharing, the passing on of knowledge. Mom, are you okay? You're not getting sentimental because of what I said about Sunset Manor, are you? Because if you are. No, sweetheart. Well, maybe a little. But it's more than that. Margaret looked out her kitchen window at the evening light fading over the garden. I've been thinking about what comes next. Not just for me, but for all of this. She gestured toward the yard, even though Susan couldn't see her. Your father and I spent so much time creating this place. It holds so many memories, so much knowledge. It seems wrong to let it all just disappear. Mom, you can't stay there just to keep Dad's memory alive. It's not just about Dad, Susan. It's about connection, community, the things we lose when we don't stay rooted somewhere long enough to put down real roots. Susan sighed. I don't understand, Mom. You could make new connections at Sunset Manor. There are activities, people your own age. People my own age who've all been uprooted too, Margaret said gently. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that choice, honey, but it's not the only choice. After they hung up, Margaret sat in her living room, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated life. Wedding photos, Susan's school pictures, Tom's certificates from the plant where he'd worked as a supervisor for 30 years. The comfortable furniture they'd chosen together, the quilts her mother had made, the books they'd shared. She thought about the young family next door, about Maria's eagerness to learn and the children's wonder at the fairy garden. She thought about Edith, alone in her assisted living facility, missing the earth beneath her fingernails and the satisfaction of nurturing growing things. And she thought about Susan, 3 hours away in her pristine suburban home with its professionally landscaped yard, too busy with her career and her own family to understand what was being lost when communities scattered to the wind. Chapter 4, The Proposal. 2 weeks later, Margaret was pruning her roses when Maria appeared at the fence, Elena by her side. "Mrs. Henley? I hope we're not bothering you." "Not at all. How are you feeling, dear?" Maria smiled, though she looked tired. "The baby's been active today." Elena wanted to see if the fairies left any footprints. They walked to the fairy garden, where Elena knelt and studied the ground with the seriousness of a scientist. Margaret had indeed sprinkled a bit of flour around the flowers early that morning, creating tiny patterns in the dirt. "There," Elena whispered excitedly. "I see them." While the little girl investigated, Maria said, "We put an offer on the house. Michael accepted it yesterday." "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, meaning it. "When do you think you'll move in?" "Next month, hopefully. The inspection is next week." Maria hesitated. "Mrs. Henley, I've been thinking about what you said about learning to garden. Would you be willing to teach me? I could pay you, of course." Margaret waved away the mention of payment. "I'd be delighted to help, but I have a better idea, if you're interested." She led Maria to the fence overlooking Edith's abandoned garden. "This breaks my heart every time I see it. Mrs. Kowalski put so much love into this space. Her herbs, her vegetables. She knew exactly what each plant needed." "It does look sad," Maria agreed. "What if we brought it back to life? Together? You could learn, the children could help, and maybe—" Margaret paused, the idea fully forming as she spoke. "Maybe Mrs. Kowalski could visit sometimes, share her knowledge." Maria's eyes lit up. "Do you think she would want to?" "I think she's probably dying to get her hands in the dirt again. But I don't know anything about gardening. What if I kill everything?" Margaret laughed. "My dear, every gardener has killed plants. It's how we learn. Besides, you won't be alone. I'll be right here." That afternoon, Margaret called Michael Kowalski. "Mrs. Henley, good to hear from you. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Michael. I wanted to talk to you about your mother's garden." She explained her idea, how Maria was eager to learn, how the children would benefit from understanding where food comes from, how Edith might enjoy having a purpose again. "I don't know," Michael said slowly. "She's settled in well at the facility. I'd hate to upset her routine. What if we started small? Maybe she could come for an afternoon, show Maria which herbs are which. No pressure, just sharing knowledge. She does complain about being bored, and she asks about the garden every time I visit." "Michael, your mother taught me more about herbs in 5 years than I'd learned in 50. She has wisdom that shouldn't be wasted." 2 days later, Michael called back. "Mom would like to visit next Saturday, if that works for you and Maria." Chapter 5. Old Roots, New Growth. Saturday dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of autumn light that makes everything look like it's been painted in gold. Margaret had been up since 6, puttering around the garden and trying not to be nervous. Maria arrived at 9, bringing coffee, cake, and both children. "David's at his new job orientation," she explained. "I hope it's okay that I brought Elena and Carlos." "Of course. Gardens are for families." Michael arrived with Edith at 10. Margaret's heart ached to see how her old neighbor had aged in just 3 months. Edith moved more slowly, leaning on a walker, but her eyes were bright as she surveyed her former domain. "Madre mia," she murmured, taking in the weeds and neglect. "What happened to my beautiful garden?" "It's been waiting for you," Margaret said gently. "Edith, I'd like you to meet Maria. She and her family are buying your house." Maria approached shyly. "Mrs. Kowalski, Mrs. Henley told me you're an amazing gardener. I was hoping you might teach me about herbs." Edith studied the young woman, taking in her pregnant belly and the children hiding behind her legs. "You want to learn?" "Very much. I want my children to understand where food comes from, to know the satisfaction of growing something themselves." Edith's weathered face softened. "Come, we look at what survived." For the next 2 hours, Margaret watched something beautiful unfold. Edith, despite her walker, moved through the garden with purpose, pointing out herbs that had survived the neglect. She showed Maria how to tell oregano from marjoram by rubbing the leaves between her fingers, how to harvest basil to encourage new growth, which plants would come back next year and which needed to be replanted. Elena and Carlos trailed behind, asking endless questions that Edith answered with growing animation. "This chives," Edith said, pointing to a clump of green shoots. "Very hardy. You cut, they grow back. Good for eggs, potatoes, everything." "Can we eat them now?" Carlos asked. "Of course. Always taste what you grow." Edith pulled a few tender shoots and handed them to the children, laughing at their expressions when they bit into the mild onion flavor. "Mrs. Kowalski," Maria said, "would you be willing to come back? Maybe once a week? I could pick you up, bring you here for the afternoon." Edith looked at Michael, who shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I don't want you to feel obligated." "Obligated?" Edith's voice carried the steel Margaret remembered. "Michael, I am 79 years old. I survived war, leaving my country, learning new language, raising children in place I never expected to call home. You think little garden work will hurt me? It's not that, Mom. It's just you worry. I know. Is good thing. Shows you love your mother. But I am not dead yet. I have knowledge in here." She tapped her temple. "And here." She placed her hand over her heart. "This young woman wants to learn. I want to teach. Is good for everyone." Margaret watched Michael struggle with the decision. She understood his dilemma, wanting to protect his mother while recognizing her need for purpose. "What if we tried it for a month?" Margaret suggested. "See how it goes. I could help too. Keep an eye on things." "Mrs. Henley, I couldn't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering. Besides," she smiled, "I might learn something new myself." Chapter 6. Growing Connections. The arrangement began tentatively. Twice a week, Margaret picked up Edith from the facility, and they spent afternoons in the garden with Maria and the children. What started as simple herb lessons expanded into something richer. Edith taught Maria to make herb-infused vinegars and oils, sharing recipes from her childhood in Poland. Maria brought stories of her grandmother's cooking in Mexico, introducing Edith to plants she'd never grown before. Margaret found herself learning alongside them, discovering new uses for familiar plants. The children thrived in the outdoor classroom. Elena learned to identify plants by their smell and texture, while Carlos appointed himself chief weed puller, though he still occasionally eliminated the wrong plants. "Is okay," Edith would say patiently. "Plants forgive us. They want to grow." One afternoon in late October, as they were preparing the garden for winter, Susan arrived unexpectedly. "Mom, I saw cars in the driveway, and oh." She stopped short at seeing the group gathered around the raised beds. Margaret felt her stomach clench. "Susan, what a surprise. Everyone, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Susan." The introductions were polite but awkward. Margaret could see Susan taking in the scene, her elderly mother kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by an even more elderly woman with a walker, a pregnant woman, and 2 small children. "Mom, could I speak with you inside?" Susan's lawyer voice was in full effect. In the kitchen, Susan didn't waste time. "What is all this?" "It's gardening, Susan. People sharing knowledge, children learning." "Mom, you're babysitting in your backyard. And what's the story with the old woman? She looks like she should be in a nursing home, not crawling around in the dirt." "That's Edith Kowalski. She's teaching Maria to garden. She's probably forgotten more about herbs than most people ever learn. She's using a walker, Mom. What if she falls? What if something happens to one of those children? Have you thought about liability?" Margaret stared at her daughter. "Liability? Yes, liability. If someone gets hurt on your property, you could be sued. Your homeowner's insurance might not cover." "Susan," Margaret's voice was quiet but firm, "when did you become so afraid of living?" "I'm not afraid of living. I'm being practical, responsible." "Are you?" Margaret moved to the window, where they could see Edith showing Elena how to save seeds from the marigolds. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're afraid of mess, afraid of risk, afraid of anything that can't be controlled and predicted. That's not fair, isn't it? You want me to move to a facility where everything is safe and sanitized and scheduled, where I won't have to worry about gardening or cooking or taking care of this house, where I won't have to deal with the messiness of real relationships." Susan was quiet for a long moment. "I just want you to be safe." "I know, sweetheart, but safe isn't the same as living." They watched as Carlos discovered a late-season butterfly on the chrysanthemums, his excited shouts bringing everyone over to see. "I was about his age when you first showed me the garden," Susan said softly. "You remember more than you let on," Margaret said. "I remember feeling important, like I was helping with something that mattered." Susan's voice was wistful. "I remember Dad lifting me up to pick apples from the tree, and you teaching me that the ugliest tomatoes sometimes taste the best. You do remember. When did I stop believing in all that?" Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. Maybe when life got so complicated that simple things seemed too simple. Outside, they could hear Edith's voice. "In Poland, We say garden teaches patience. You cannot hurry tomatoes. You cannot force flowers to bloom. But if you tend them with love, they give you more than you expect. Susan squeezed her mother's hand. Mom, I owe you an apology. I've been so focused on what could go wrong that I forgot to see what was going right. You worry because you love me. I understand that. But I also forgot that you're still capable of making good decisions. This, she gestured toward the window. This is beautiful, Mom. It's exactly what you and Dad would have wanted. Chapter 7. Harvest Time. November brought the first frost and the last of the season's harvest. The garden project had evolved into something none of them had expected, a true community that extended beyond property lines. David Santos had built raised beds that were easier for Edith to tend. Other neighbors had begun stopping by, drawn by the activity and the children's laughter. Mrs. Patterson, the one who'd recommended Sunset Manor, brought cuttings from her prize-winning dahlias. The young couple who'd moved into the Johnson place learned to make Edith's famous pickled vegetables. Margaret's house became the unofficial headquarters for what people had started calling the Garden Circle. Her kitchen table hosted planning sessions for next year's plantings, recipe exchanges, and informal Polish language lessons that Edith offered to anyone interested. Susan began visiting more frequently, sometimes bringing her husband Jake and their teenage son Ryan. To Margaret's surprise, Ryan showed genuine interest in the herb garden, asking intelligent questions about organic pest control and companion planting. He's thinking about studying environmental science, Susan confided one afternoon as they watched Ryan help Carlos build a toad house. I never would have guessed he'd be interested in anything that involved getting his hands dirty. Children know more than we think, Margaret said. We just have to give them opportunities to discover it. The week before Thanksgiving, Maria gave birth to a healthy daughter, Isabella. Edith proclaimed herself an honorary grandmother and immediately began planning a kitchen garden specifically designed for teaching young children. This baby, she will grow up knowing where food comes from, Edith declared, gently holding the sleeping infant. She will know satisfaction of eating tomato warm from vine, herbs picked fresh for dinner. This is gift we give. Margaret felt a deep contentment as she looked around her living room, filled with the sounds of multiple conversations in English and Spanish, with occasional Polish phrases thrown in. Elena was showing Susan's son Ryan her collection of pressed flowers. Carlos was explaining the Toad House project to Jake, who listened with the patience of a man learning to see value in things beyond spreadsheets. This wasn't the life she'd planned for her retirement. She'd imagined quiet days, perhaps some travel with Tom, certainly not a house filled with young families and the cheerful chaos that accompanied them. But it was better than what she'd planned. It was alive. Chapter 8. Winter Plans, Spring Dreams. December brought snow and the cozy satisfaction of planning for next year's garden. Margaret's dining room table was covered with seed catalogs, graph paper, and coffee cups as the garden circle met weekly to dream about spring. I want to try growing peppers, Maria said, still learning to navigate life with a newborn. My grandmother always said you couldn't grow good peppers this far north, but Mrs. Patterson thinks we could if we start them early enough indoors. Is possible, Edith agreed. Need warm wall, protection from wind. I show you in spring. What about medicinal herbs? Asked Sarah, the young mother from down the street. My daughter gets earaches all the time, and I'd rather try natural remedies first. Edith's eyes lit up. This was her specialty, knowledge passed down from her grandmother and refined through decades of experience. Chamomile for stomach, calendula for skin, echinacea for when you feel sick coming. I teach you to make teas, tinctures, salves. Margaret watched the exchange with deep satisfaction. Knowledge was being passed forward, traditions were taking root in new soil, and community was growing in the most organic way possible. Susan, who had started joining these winter planning sessions, looked up from the notebook where she'd been taking careful notes. Mom, what about expansion? Mrs. Chen mentioned that her backyard gets terrible drainage. What if we created a rain garden there? It would help with runoff and give us space for plants that like wet feet. Margaret smiled. Her practical daughter, once she'd committed to something, approached it with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to her legal practice. And I've been researching grants, Susan continued. There are funds available for community garden projects, especially ones that focus on intergenerational learning and food security. Grants. Edith looked confused. Money, Margaret explained. to help pay for supplies, tools, maybe even a small greenhouse. People pay us to teach children about gardens? Edith shook her head in wonder. In Poland, we just called this living. Jake, who had been quietly sketching on graph paper, looked up. I could help with the business plan. Lay out the costs, project the benefits. Benefits? Edith interrupted. What benefits you need to project? Children learn, families eat better food, neighbors know each other. These things have no price. But they do have value, Jake said respectfully. And if we can show that value in ways that funding organizations understand, we can help more people. Margaret watched this exchange with fascination. Jake was learning Edith's language of practical wisdom, while Edith was beginning to understand that Jake's spreadsheets could serve purposes beyond corporate profits. What are you thinking, Mom? Susan asked, noticing her contemplation. I'm thinking about your father, Margaret said. He would have loved this. He always said the best projects were the ones that solved multiple problems at once. Like what? Teaching children where food comes from, giving elderly people a sense of purpose, building community connections, providing fresh, healthy food, preserving traditional knowledge. Margaret ticked off items on her fingers. One garden, many solutions. That's exactly the kind of thinking that wins grants, Jake said, his enthusiasm building. We could document everything: the knowledge transfer, the community building, the educational component, the health benefits. You want to turn our garden into homework? Carlos asked, looking worried. Everyone laughed. No, Mijo, Maria assured him. We just want to make sure more children get to learn what you're learning. Chapter 9, Seeds of Tomorrow. By February, what had started as a simple gardening arrangement had grown into something remarkable. The grant application Jake and Susan had prepared was approved, providing funds for tools, soil amendments, and a small greenhouse that could serve as a year-round learning center. More importantly, news of the project had spread throughout Millbrook and beyond. Margaret found herself fielding calls from other communities interested in starting similar programs. A reporter from the regional newspaper wanted to write a feature story. The county extension office asked Edith to speak at their Master Gardener training program. I don't understand why everyone's so excited, Edith said as Margaret drove her back to the facility after a particularly busy planning meeting. We just teaching children to grow food. People have done this for thousands of years. Maybe that's exactly why everyone's excited, Margaret replied. Because we almost forgot how to do it, and you're helping us remember. Humph. People forget too easy these days. But Margaret could tell Edith was pleased. She'd started referring to the various garden plots as my classroom, and had begun writing down her recipes and growing tips in a notebook Maria had given her. For the children, she explained when Margaret asked about it, so they don't have to remember everything in their heads like I did. The notebook had grown thick with accumulated wisdom, not just about gardening, but about life. Edith wrote about the importance of patience, about learning from failure, about the satisfaction of feeding others with food you'd grown yourself. Mrs. Henley, Elena said one snowy afternoon as they looked through seed catalogs at Margaret's kitchen table. Are you going to move away like my friend Jessica's grandma did? The question caught Margaret off guard. What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Jessica said old people have to live in special places when they get too old to take care of themselves. Margaret looked at this serious 6-year-old, thinking about how to answer honestly without causing worry. Well, Elena, some older people do choose to live in places where they can get help with things like cooking and cleaning. But not all older people make that choice. Are you going to? I don't think so. Not as long as I have friends like you and your family to help me stay connected to all the things I love. Like gardening, and like teaching, and like being part of a community where people take care of each other. Elena considered this seriously. I think you should stay here. Who would teach us about fairies if you moved away? Margaret hugged the little girl, feeling tears prick her eyes. That's an excellent point. Chapter 10, Full Circle. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of new beginnings that felt different from the simple cycle of seasons. The garden project had grown beyond anything Margaret had imagined when she'd first suggested restoring Edith's herb patch. 3 additional families had joined the core group. The raised beds had multiplied, spreading across 4 adjoining backyards with the enthusiastic cooperation of neighbors who discovered they enjoyed the activity and community as much as the fresh vegetables. Susan had taken a leave of absence from her law firm to help coordinate what had officially become the Millbrook Intergenerational Garden Initiative. She'd moved back to town temporarily, staying in her old bedroom while she worked on expanding the program to other neighborhoods. "I forgot how much I missed this place," she told Margaret one morning as they planned the day's activities. "Not just the house, but the pace of life. The way people actually have time to talk to each other. Are you thinking of staying?" Susan was quiet for a long moment. "Jake and I have been talking about it. Ryan's heading to college next year anyway, and there are environmental law opportunities in the state capital just an hour away. We could keep the house in Columbus and see how it goes." Margaret felt a flutter of hope, but tried to keep her expression neutral. "What does Jake think?" "He's the one who suggested it. He says he's learned more about community development in the past 6 months than he did in 10 years of corporate consulting. He wants to help other towns start similar programs." The official launch celebration was planned for the first Saturday in May. The mayor would be there, along with representatives from the university extension program and several news outlets. But Margaret found herself more excited about the unofficial celebration happening that morning. Edith's return to her own garden for the first time in nearly a year. Michael had been nervous about the idea, but Edith had been insistent. She wanted to see the garden at its spring best, wanted to show the children which herbs to harvest for the celebration feast, wanted to plant the tomato seedlings she'd been nurturing in the assisted living facility's solarium. "Mom, are you sure you're up for this?" Michael asked as he helped her from the car. "Michael, I am up for anything that gets me out of that place and into real dirt," Edith replied tartly. The garden was glorious. Margaret had never seen it so full of life and purpose. Children's voices mixed with adult laughter as families worked side by side, planting, weeding, harvesting early greens for the celebration salad. Edith moved slowly through the spaces, leaning on her walker but stopping frequently to examine plants, offer advice, accept the shy offerings of flowers from the younger children. "Mrs. Kowalski." Elena ran up with a handful of chives. "Look what I remembered to harvest." "Very good. And how do you cut them?" "Like this." Elena demonstrated with child-safe scissors, "so they'll grow back." "Perfect. You are becoming real gardener." Margaret watched from her own yard, feeling a deep contentment settle into her bones. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just a way to fill her retirement years, but a way to make them meaningful. "Mom." Susan appeared at her elbow. "The reporter wants to interview you for her story." "Me? I'm not the interesting one. Edith is the expert. Maria is the young mother learning traditional skills. Mom, you're the one who made this all happen. You're the one who saw possibilities instead of problems, who brought everyone together." Margaret looked around at the bustling activity, at neighbors who had become friends, at children learning lessons that would last lifetimes, at elderly people finding purpose in sharing their knowledge. "I didn't make this happen," she said. "I just planted seeds. Community grew itself." Epilogue. The garden continues. 1 year later, Margaret stood in her kitchen, looking out at a garden that had grown beyond her wildest dreams. The Millbrook model had been replicated in 12 other towns across 3 states. Edith's notebook of traditional knowledge had been published as a small book, with proceeds funding garden programs in low-income communities. Susan and Jake had indeed moved back to Millbrook, buying the house 3 streets over that had the big backyard and southern exposure perfect for growing peppers. Ryan was studying environmental science at the state university and spent his summers helping expand the garden programs. Maria's daughter Isabella, now walking and getting into everything, had appointed herself chief flower picker and distributed drooping dandelions to anyone who would accept them. Elena and Carlos were seasoned gardeners who served as mentors to newer, younger participants. Edith, at 80, had become something of a local celebrity. The assisted living facility had created a greenhouse specifically for her use, and she spent her mornings there before being transported to various garden sites in the afternoons. She claimed the activity was keeping her young, and Margaret was inclined to believe her. The phone rang, interrupting Margaret's morning contemplation. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Henley? This is Patricia Walsh from Riverside, Oregon. I read about your garden program in a magazine, and I'm wondering if you could help us get something similar started here. We have several elderly residents with extensive gardening knowledge and young families eager to learn."